And good morning, I'm Peter McLaughlin, citizen producer for Connecticut Television, Channel 192. We're here in beautiful Washington, Connecticut this morning. It's Saturday, March the 6th, 2015. It's about 21 degrees. And we're here at the Institute for American Indian Studies to see Mr. Jim Dina do a demonstration of some ancient primitive skills. This morning, we're going to learn how Native Americans made maple syrup. So let's get to it.
Good morning, I'm Jim Dina, and it's early March, end of the first week, and we're out here to do some maple sugaring in the style of Native Americans. And I've been doing a demo very similar to this at the Institute for Native American Studies for about 15 years, and it's also always a pleasure to get out here during the thawing time and do some sugaring. The type of setup I have here would be what I call pre-contact, which means before Europeans arrived in New England. So native peoples would have had only Stone Age tools to use to do this kind of thing. And of course, the most essential thing here is the maple tree. And most people know how this works, but I think it would be fun to just review some of the ideas behind what happens here. The sap is stored in the roots of the tree. And that particular sap has a lot of sugars in it, and it was made last summer by the leaves. And of course, we kind of know how this goes, but it's interesting because it benefits us. So the tree takes water from the ground through its roots, H2O, brings it up to the leaves, and combines it with carbon dioxide, CO2, which is something we breathe out. And it combines CO2, carbon dioxide, and H2O, the water, into something called C6H12O6. That's the chemical formula for sugar. But the plus side for us is that there are 6 oxygens left over for every sugar it produces. So the tree returns oxygen to the atmosphere for us to breathe. So we not only get sugar out of the maple sap, we get something to breathe too. So these trees are really good friends to us. What I've done here now is cut the tree with Stone Age tools like this. Here's a stone axe, and an axe does not make a very nice cut at all. It's a long slash in the tree. And to make it a little neater, I've also used a stone knife, a flint knife, and kind of sawed a groove in there. And of course, when you cut the tree, it bleeds. It bleeds sap. You know, I guess the same way you could think that we bleed blood if we cut our skin. But the tree has plenty of extra sap though, so it doesn't mind giving us some. And then I stuck in a split stick called a sap guide. Otherwise the sap would just run down the tree and it would be very hard to collect. And to glue it in place so it doesn't leak, I actually used a piece of what we call pine pitch, the sap from a pine tree. I melted it in the fire and I spread it all along here and glued the sap guide in. And today we're getting a very nice sap run. The sap is running very well, even though it's fairly early in the day. And as the sun gets higher, this will drip faster and faster. So now that we've got the sap flowing, a native person, myself for instance, would put on his snowshoes because this snow is about 2.5 feet deep. I might put on that fur deerskin jacket, but it's kind of warm today, so I'm comfortable. And I would pick up this birch bark bucket, and I would go to the various trees out in the forest here that I have tapped in the same way. And the birch bark bucket is made by folding birch bark, stitching it with pine roots, and then waterproofing it again with pine pitch. So this is basically a waterproof bucket. And I would collect the sap that I tapped from the tree, and I would put the birch bark dish back to collect more, and I would go off to my next tree and visit all the trees I had tapped until I had enough sap to boil down. All right, so let's say we've done that, because we really have, and we're back at camp now. And I'm going to put some water, not water, sugar water, or sap as we call it, right in this wooden trough. Now, I suspect some people are wondering why I don't put the sap in this clay pot to boil it down. Well, it turns out that there are probably 30 or 40 waters for every syrup that we could create. In other words, if I boil down 30 gallons of sap, I will get only 1 gallon of syrup or sugar, depending on what we want to make. And that is a tremendous amount of boiling to do. And to do that, I would need a big rolling boil, and that would destroy a clay pot. Because when you cook in clay pots, for instance, a stew of some kind with meat and vegetables and other wild plants, it's a very slow fire you have around the pot. And if you get the fire too high, you'll crack it. And this is a very bad time of year to make pottery. The clay that you would like to use for pottery is frozen under the snow. And so you would not use a clay pot except for the very last stages when you got syrup and wanted to turn it into sugar. So we'll put the clay pot aside since we're not using it. And this wooden trough here will stand up to boiling, and we're going to use a method that native people had for other kinds of cooking. It's called stone boiling. So we're going to start a fire, we're going to heat some stones hot, we'll drop them in this trough here, and we'll see how effective stone boiling is. All right, so we have some very hot stones here that we've been heating in the fire, and we're just going to drop them right in, and you'll be amazed how quickly this gets the sap hot. Stones take a long time to heat. They have a large heat capacity, and they'll stay hot even in the liquid for a long time. All right. So, now that's already too hot to stick my hand in. And you just keep adding stones like this. And this will eventually get into a boil. And it's amazing how fast the sap level will drop. And I'll have to add new sap very shortly. You can see how much steam is coming up from the boiling trough there as I add the hot rocks, and the steam actually smells sweet, and that's from the sugar, but most of the sugars are staying in there in the boiling trough. And the secret to the trough itself is that the stones are surrounded by liquid, even on the bottom where they almost touch the wood. So you'll never burn through a trough like this, whereas the clay pot, as I mentioned, would get destroyed pretty quickly. Now, I'm doing this all alone, but in fact, in the old days, I wouldn't have been doing this. The squaws, my wife would have been doing this. She would tend the stones and put them in. The daughters would be over here tending the fire, rotating the stones so that Mom always had hot stones available. And the boys would be out in the forest collecting firewood, and that was a big job. They would not have used a stone axe for that kind of thing. They'd have gone and collected dead wood that was just laying on the ground from the trees. And with all the snow we have, that might have been a project. And I'm not sure what the guys were doing. I think they were probably sitting back in one of the wigwams there talking about real important things and what their next move was going to be tomorrow. So it was mostly the women and children that did this kind of sugaring work. Some of these stones are cool. I'll take them out of here and add new ones to it. Put those back in the fire, which is dying a little. There's a big one. And wow, you can see how quickly that heats it up. And this whole trough is frothing, and if I don't add some more liquid pretty soon, it'll probably bubble over. And another one. And we'll take some of the cool ones out. And this is all there is to it. Now, the first time I did this many years ago for the Institute, at the end of the day, I had something in here that was very sweet, but it looked like mud. And I can suspect you can imagine how that happened. As I'm taking these stones out of the fire, they're all covered with charcoal, and there's no really good way to clean them. And the charcoal gets into the sap. And at the end of the day, I almost threw the stuff out the first time. We did this many years ago, but I collected it in a jar and brought it home. And of course my wife said, let's see your sap. And I showed her this muddy looking jar of stuff. And you can imagine what she said. I left the jar on the kitchen counter, and when I came down next morning, guess what? The soot was all at the bottom settled, and I had this beautiful amber liquid on top of it. And here's the sap I made from last year's run. Now, it doesn't look like very much because I'm doing this all alone, and it's a demo, and I'm explaining things and doing a lot of talking. But you can see that there's still a little soot in the bottom of this bottle. And if I actually let this settle and pour it off one more time, I'll even get rid of that little bit of soot. So that was how you clean this up later. Now, there are very few records, in fact, next to none, from New England about how this was done. And because the colonists here, a lot of them weren't particularly literate, and they were having a hard time just making a living when they first came here, especially dealing with winter, how to live, how to plant crops the next spring. But there are good records from a place called New France, which we know as Quebec today. And the French Jesuit priests were a literate cadre who kept records and wrote things down about the French settlements there and the native people. And one enticing piece of literature that I found mentioned that the Indian women showed the French women how to make maple syrup and maple sugar. But the Jesuits commented, and this is a very tantalizing clue, that the French women's sugar tasted better, that the Indian women's sugar tasted burnt. And I'm going to guess that that's a veiled reference to putting red hot stones into the sap, because the sap next to the hot stone eventually burns a little. But it's not a bad taste. So they didn't mention why it tasted burnt, but I would conjecture that it's because they used exactly this method. Now, once we get the sap in this order, we could use it right away, I suppose, but native peoples had no really good way to transport liquids long distances. And of course, this little modern bottle has a screw cap on it, so even if I turned it upside down, I'm not going to lose any. And with a birch bark bucket like this, it has a top on it, but can you imagine boiling down a nice gallon worth of syrup here and having somebody come by and kick it over and all the syrup spills out? Oh, you say, oh my goodness, all that work, we've lost our syrup. So what native people most likely did at this point was then, when they had syrup that was turning amber, they would have gone to the clay pot again. That is exactly what I did the first time I ever did this many years ago. I put this amber liquid, which is almost syrup, into the clay pot with a very slow fire, and just at the liquid level, as it was dropping and more water was evaporating, I could see these tiny crystals forming. And I grabbed the stick and flicked the crystals onto the stick. They stuck very easily. Put them on a piece of birch bark, a piece of birch paper, as we call it, and just kept doing this until it was all the way down, and I had a bunch of sugar crystals on the birch bark paper. Folded it up, tied it, and those now in sugar, which is solid, that can be carried very easily as an emergency ration or a traveling ration. And if I were going to some other village that perhaps was 5 miles away, walking of course, on an Indian trail, I would probably carry a little pouch on my belt here, and it would be filled with ground up corn and some maple sugar crystals, and that would be quick energy food, the corn providing the protein and the quick sugars for energy from the maple sugar. So most likely sugar was the final product that Native Americans would have used. And the reason why we get such a good sugar run in New England is quite simple. And going back to the tree itself, which is where we started, The buds now at this time would like to grow some new leaves. However, they don't have much energy. Last summer's syrup, or sap, they didn't have, we have syrup, the tree has just sap. Last summer's sap was stored for the winter down in the roots of the tree. And it's kept there all winter because the tree is inactive. And in the spring, the buds now call for some quick energy to jumpstart the growth of leaves because they can't do it alone. So they send a signal somehow to the roots to send sap up. And that is exactly what is happening today. This little bit of sap is not going to make it because we're stealing it from the tree. But in other parts of the tree, it is going up to the buds right now, and the buds are filling up, and they are going to start growing leaves as soon as the temperature rises a little more. And they'll continue to do this for a couple of months. When those leaves are grown, then they'll combine carbon dioxide and water to make this precious sugar and some oxygen for us, as we talked about earlier. Now, something's going to happen a little later today. When the sun, which is quite high now, starts to go behind the hill, the buds will realize that, oops, it's too cold to grow leaves. So they're going to tell the sap to come back down. And tomorrow, if the sun comes out again and it gets to about 40 degrees, it'll come back up again. Now, everybody knows that in New England, we have this terrible spring weather where it's warm, cold, warm, cold. So the sap run lasts for maybe a month, or at least 2 or 3 weeks, and we get a lot of sap. Now, during the late 1700s and early 1800s, there was a sugar trade from the Caribbean islands, which were tropical. They grew sugar cane there, and it was exported in sailing ships back to Europe. And the Napoleonic Wars of that time, between France and England especially, disrupted a lot of sea trade. So the people in Austria, where they had some nice maples in the Austrian Alps and Carpathian Mountains, got the idea, why don't we try a sugar run and make syrup from our maples? And they did, but the sugar run was so short because in Austria, winter gets over, it starts to warm up, and the buds get their sugar in a short period of time, perhaps a few days or a week. So they didn't get the big sap run we get because of the terrible weather here in New England. So in a way, it's kind of a blessing, I guess. Good morning, I'm Jim Dina, and I'm in my backyard here in South Windsor, Connecticut, not in the high Arctic, as you might expect from this little building behind me. And as you know, it's called an igloo in the native tongue of the Eskimos, or as they're correctly called, the Inuit people of the far north in the high Arctic. And sometimes they were built larger than this for families living in for an extended period of time. This is more typical of a 1 or 2 man igloo that would have been built in a hunter's camp. And they would have been fishing through holes in the ice or spearing seals through holes in the ice. And I have a fishing spear behind me right now. I think I'll stick to fish. Getting around a little locally, of course, I'd have some snowshoes, and sled dogs would be sleeping out here somewhere. And these are fun buildings, and a lot of people who build them in this part of New England when we have enough snow. And we've got about 3 feet on the ground here, and it's compressed down, and we'll show a little later how you actually start to build one of these. People sometimes have fun by making a big mound of